Hi there. In this video we'll create a data persistence layer that's going to store data in a SQL database. So I'm going to assume that you've watched the other videos up till now. If not, you'll need to go back and watch the other videos in this series. And I'm also going to assume that you've got SQL Express installed as part of your development environment. We're going to use something called a repository pattern to store our data, combined with EntityFramework. We'll also be adhering to dependency inversion principles, or DI, and generic classes. This is going to give us two big advantages. With DI, we won't reference static repositories. Instead, we'll use interfaces and dependency injection that we can then easier test later on. And using generics will allow us to write a single common repository class that will have all the standard methods for retrieving and storing data, such as get and insert, but it will dynamically write to whatever underlying table using the object that we throw at it. I'm going to be relying on some code from my own GitHub pages to do this. I often store various code here, and for this video I'll be grabbing some of the code for the actual common patterns repo. Now I'm not actually going to go too in depth on how we build the repository pattern. We're going to be copying and pasting the code from my GitHub. However, if you are interested in understanding more of this, please check out my series of training courses at www.completecoder.net. In here I specifically cover creating some of the frameworks such in my real world ASP.NET development course. So to get the common patterns, we're going to be going to github.com/completecoder, and we're going to want the common patterns library. And in here is where we'll see our various different code and things, and in particular we'll want the data persistence folder, and we'll be using the SQL repository and the data context from here. But we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. So in our core data solution, I'm going to create a new project. Again, it's going to be a class library. And I'm going to call this one agility .data.SQL repository. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to need some interfaces. So I'm going to go back to my core project here, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call this contracts. And in here we will put the interface that we'll use that will allow us to do dependency injection against our repository. So in this contracts folder, I'm going to create an interface. So from here we're going to add a class. We will call this iRepository. And we're going to change it from a class to an interface. And what I'm going to do now is, if we just go to our common patterns project, in the completecode.common, in the contracts folder, you'll see we've got an iRepository here. So actually what I'm going to do is just copy and paste all this actually. Okay, so this is our iRepository. So we're using this T, where T is a base entity. Now we're going to need to change this because we've actually called this entity base. I just got this the wrong way around. So let's just change that round to entity base, because what we're doing is we're saying any object that we throw at this is going to be based on this entity base. Let's just resolve that class. Okay, we'll get rid of these using statements that aren't required and save that. So that's our basic repository. As you can see, we're going to have commit, delete, find, insert, update, and get collection, which will return as a list. Okay, now back to our SQL repository. The first thing we're going to need to do is add some references to this. So we'll manage NuGet packages, and we want to install EntityFramework. So we're using 6.2. Okay, I'm also going to add some references to our other projects. We want the core project and the models project. And now in here, we're going to want to create our iRepository class. Sorry, not the iRepository, the actual repository class. So this is going to be our generic repository. So we'll call this we'll call this SQL repository. And again, if we just go back to my GitHub project, go into data persistence, SQL repository, and again, let's just copy and paste all of this. We'll just do this bit here and resolve everything else. So it wants to implement iRepository T, so we're going to use the contracts. Again, we just need to change this from base entity to entity base and resolve that. Next, we need to resolve these because these are all using EntityFramework. Actually, no, we come back to data context. We need to create that yet, so let's just resolve db set t. Okay, that's all fine. So what we need to do is implement this data context. So again, in here, let's just create a new class that we will call data context. And again, back in GitHub, let's just go and get the data context from there. So it's quite a simple class, this one. The important thing is it inherits from DB context, which is comes with EntityFramework. Resolve that. And while we're at it, let's just add these DB sets. So this is where we tell EntityFramework what actual tables we need. So let's just copy and paste that a few times. So data model, data property, schema and schema property, data model, schema properties. Okay, that's fine. So now back in here, so data context resolving, and that's all fine. Okay, save that and close it down. Let's just, while we're at it, just delete this. Okay, so with that done, we're ready to actually hook up our web API using the SQL repository. So we need to install a couple of things in the web API, a couple of NuGet packages. The first thing we're going to need to do is install EntityFramework again. Let's just go in and install that. And we also want to install something called Unity. And specifically, we want unity.asp.net.web API. So install that, which will in turn install some of the other Unity packages that we're dependent on. Okay, so once that's all installed, what we need to do is we need to hook up some items. Now, rather than use one of these models that we've currently got, because all these are kind of interdependent on each other, the first thing I want to do is actually just go ahead and create something a bit simpler. So I'm actually going to create a new model here. Now, when we created the schema, you'll remember that we created an application ID, and this was a way to group schemas and models within the context of an application. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create that class. Let's just add a new class here, which we will call application. Just like our other classes, we're going to make it inherit from entity base. And all we're going to have a single property called application name. So let's add that. Next, let's go into our SQL repository and update the data context to add the applications. And now what we're going to do, back into our web API, we're going to, using the Unity Dependency Injection framework, we're going to hook up the iRepository application to the iRepository application interface. So going to app start and Unity config, and we want to scroll down here until we find this bit at the bottom, which is register types. And as you can see, we've got an example here of what we do, what we need to type. And what this basically does, it allows us to specify an interface and then a concrete class. So we're going to register the interface iRepository for the application model, and we're going to say whenever we come across iRepository, we're going to use the SQL repository concrete class again with the application model. So all we do is in here, let's add a line called container.register type. It's going to be iRepository application. Let's just resolve these. So we've not added the reference to core, but we get the option to do that here. So add reference to agility.core. Again, we want to add a reference to core data.models. Then we have comma, and we then SQL repository application. And again, just resolve that SQL repository, add reference to agility.data.SQL repository, and then that's hooked up. So when we start, anytime we reference iRepository application, it knows it needs to actually use SQL repository application. So now that's hooked up, let's go and create a controller. So in controllers, right click, add controller. We're going to use a web API to controller with read-write actions. Now we're not going to tell it to use EntityFramework. I just want it to actually spit out the read-write actions. We'll call this applications. So this just scaffolds out a very basic API controller for us and gives in some example endpoints that we might want, for example, get by ID, post and put, and so on. In the next video, we're going to actually rip out all this and build it with all our values using our repository, and then we'll hook everything up and test it. So join me in the next video right now, and we'll get on and do that.